I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the Ukrainian counterattack in the south. We talk about the Russian Telegram channels that give us a very different understanding of the conflict than state media, and we analyse questions of weapon and ammunition supply from the west to Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 5th of September, day 194. And today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, senior technology reporter Gareth Caulfield, and, calling in live from Westminster, our Whitehall editor, Tony Diver. Before our daily updates, however, it's been quite a momentous day in British politics, with the climax of the ruling Conservative Party's leadership election. I called the Telegraph's Whitehall editor, Tony Diver, to tell us a bit about the UK's incoming Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and get a sense of what this might mean for the UK's support for Ukraine.
Well, that's right, David. The big news today for us is that Liz Truss has won the Conservative leadership race, which means that tomorrow lunchtime she will be made Prime Minister. And obviously that has pretty significant ramifications for the UK's next steps in all areas of domestic policy, but also foreign policy and what she might do next in terms of our diplomatic relationship with the Ukrainians and our possibility of military support in either arms or financial ways. So that's the big news this morning. She won the race with a slightly smaller majority than we perhaps would have expected. But she, with 57% of the eligible votes from Tory members, she's now going to become the next Prime Minister.
Thanks, Tony. Can you tell us a little bit about her? Lots of our listeners all over the world, they might not have heard the name Liz Truss too often. So can you give us just a brief précis of her career and her motivations and all of that stuff?
Yeah, well, Liz Truss is one of the longest-serving ministers in the government. In fact, I think she is the longest-serving minister in the British government. She's worked her way up from being elected first as a backbencher, a number of different jobs, most recently as Foreign Secretary. That's her current job, but prior to that, she'd been Justice Secretary, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, International Development Secretary, all within the government. I think, foreign listeners might know her as the Foreign Secretary. They might have seen her either at diplomatic summits. Some of her key moments as Foreign Secretary, one of them, for instance, is her visit to Russia, where she had a very awkward meeting with Sergei Lavrov. But she has been sort of at the forefront of the Ukrainian effort on the British side since the beginning of the war. And she'll be hoping to carry that with her into Downing Street tomorrow.
So can you tell us a little bit about what has she said so far about Ukraine? Do we have a sense of how her policy may differ from Boris Johnson, the outgoing PM? How might she change how Britain is approaching supporting Ukraine in this conflict?
Well, I think we can probably expect her to be a continuity candidate on Ukraine to some extent, given that she has been involved pretty seriously in the formation of Britain's response up until now as Foreign Secretary. Her, together with Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, who is expected to retain his job as Defence Secretary once she takes office tomorrow. But the Ukraine crisis has featured pretty prominently during the Conservative leadership race, and Liz Truss has promised to be Ukraine's greatest friend if she was elected to be Prime Minister. So there's a sort of conscious effort by her to point out that she'd been involved in the response up until now. She's also said that she'd be happy to step up the UK's involvement in terms of financial support. And basically, she's saying that she would like to continue what Boris Johnson's been doing. And we have actually had some words on this already from Vladimir Zelensky, who said that he was concerned about the idea of Boris resigning because Boris Johnson had been such a support to the Ukrainian people, but that he hoped the successor to him would be just as supportive. And you can imagine that Liz Truss probably does fulfill that role. The other thing Liz Truss has said is that Zelensky is going to be the first person she calls once she takes office tomorrow. There's always this slightly weird situation where world leaders queue up to congratulate each other after one of them is elected. And often it's the United States that receives the first call. Sometimes it's France, sometimes Germany. But in this case, she'll hold off on everyone else and call Zelensky first. So that's a sort of demonstration of what she sees as her commitment to continuing Britain's support for Ukraine in the war.
And from your perspective, have you heard any whispers of a potential Truss visit to Kyiv, or has that not been talked about just yet?
No, I don't think we know anything about that yet, although it's worth saying that we don't usually know about prime ministerial visits to Kyiv. They normally keep them a secret for security reasons. I think it's probably fairly safe to assume that she'll want to go there at some point, given that it was the sort of totemic moments of Boris Johnson's premiership when he went. And we do have to remember, of course, domestically, Liz Truss will be on election footing almost straight away once she gets into Downing Street. So you would have thought, given that plays well domestically, that it's likely that she'll make some sort of visit. But no, we don't know anything about it yet.
Brilliant. Tony Diver, thank you very much. Thanks for coming on and just explaining a little bit of who Liz Truss is and how she might impact the war in Ukraine from a British perspective. I'm sure that will be hugely appreciated by our listenership abroad. So thank you very much, Tony. Roland Oliphant, can I come to you next? We last spoke on Friday as a podcast. What are the major developments in Ukraine over the weekend and today?
Well, starting with the battlefield, the Kherson counterattack, the Ukrainians are now claiming a degree of success. They're still keeping it close to their chests. Where is this? What exactly is going on? The information blackout, the operational security blackout remains in place, frustratingly. Volodymyr Zelensky, in his nightly address last night, kind of hailed the liberation of 2 settlements in the south of the country and a third in the east. So we think that means 2 on the Kherson offensive and 1 out in Donbass. He wouldn't name them, said he was getting good reports from his commanders. He wouldn't name them, but other sources, Ukrainian officials, open source stuff, and also pro-Russian Telegram channels all seem to agree that the Ukrainians have taken this place called Vysokopilya. It's a place, a village of about 3,700 people. At the northern side of that Kherson pocket, so about 12 miles from the bank of the Dnipro River, on that northern front, they've taken that town, which is something they've been pushing for a long time. In the context of this war, I mean, look, it's not a breakthrough, but it's not to be sneezed at when villages change hands, because as we saw in Donbass and elsewhere in this stage of the war, advances are incremental. So I don't think that's to be dismissed. It does suggest that the Ukrainians are making progress, and to some degree this offensive is going their way. Now, the thing in the east is interesting. Again, no confirmation on the place, but other sources talking about a place called Ozernia or Ozernoye. Now, that's interesting because that's on the other side of the Seversky Donets River, which we were talking about a lot back in May, which suggests the Ukrainians have crossed the river on boats, done a little amphibious operation. I don't know if they're hanging around there. It sounds to me a little bit risky putting up a new bridgehead. Could suggest the Russians have taken so many forces out of the east to bolster Kherson that they're struggling to hold, to really pin down that line. Nonetheless, look, the British Ministry of Defence today assesses that here's the quote. Russia's main effort almost certainly remains its Donbass offensive. That's mainly around Avdiivka, which is near Donetsk, and Bakhmut, further north. Now, the Russians are in the suburbs of Bakhmut, and a place called Soledar. They have made progress. It's slow progress. The Brits are saying, they're making about 1 kilometre a week, but it's clear the Russians are still aiming to get further into the Donetsk region. They still retain this objective of liberating, as they would call it, all of the Donetsk region, and then they can say we've done what we came here to do, which was to quote unquote liberate what they call the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Couple of other developments. We've had the pro-Russian administration, the installed occupation administration in Kherson, saying the referendum was meant to happen, presumably a referendum on unification with Russia. That's being postponed indefinitely due to the security situation. And on the energy front, interestingly, we've just had Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, basically explicitly linking the shutdown of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline to sanctions. He's basically said, this is the way he puts it, We've got one bit of machinery that's not working, that's holding up the whole thing, but we can't repair it because of sanctions, because we can't get the parts and things like that. So basically, Nord Stream 1 stays closed until your sanctions are lifted. That is the implicit threat. As always, there's a lot of wriggle room, and it's never made absolutely explicit. Those are, for my money, and I apologise if I missed something, pretty much the main developments so far today.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. Just one question from me. You mentioned in one of your answers about the finding information from the sort of pro-Russia Telegram blogs. Could you tell us a little bit more about these? How do these people? Who are these people? Because I've heard them mentioned several times in stories and as a potentially reliable source when we're talking about what's happening on the battlefield. But who exactly are they? Who are they broadcasting to? And what's their relationship with Russian society? I mean, we're reading them. Are normal Russians reading them as well?
Great question. So there's a bunch of them. So in Russia, you have the mainstream media, right? Us. So most of which is state controlled. That's your official stuff. But then there's this kind of community of war reporters, freelancers, bloggers. Some of them are anonymous. There's one called Rebar, which has, hold on, I'm just going to look at him now. How many followers has he got? 674,839 subscribers. So big followers. Some of them are ex-soldiers. Some of them are explicitly linked to different armed groups. So the Wagner mercenary group, private military company they call themselves, has one. There's a branch of Wagner called Rossich who have one, and then you have these kind of personal branded kind of self-made war correspondents. There's a guy who runs something called War Gonzo. There are reports he's actually been arrested in Moscow recently because, listen, this is unconfirmed, but it was going around that he had inadvertently revealed Russian positions on one of his videos. And then you have the kind of the radical guys like Igor Gherkin Strelkov, who is an FSB man who basically ran Russia's 2014 war in Ukraine, has now become this kind of self-appointed commentator, would-be leader of the patriotic far right, who's kind of a thorn in the side of the Kremlin, but they kind of tolerate him for one reason or another. Now, the reason these guys are interesting, and there is a bit of variation depending who you're talking about, is that although they are absolutely uniformly pro-Russia, pro-war, completely hook, line and sinker, we are fighting the Nazis, all of that, we'll march to Kiev, blah, blah, blah. They can be pretty critical, right? So that they're not always on the leash. And there was a bit of a conflict blew up between them and the military high command a few months ago, where one of them kind of publicly complained on Telegram, look, I'm not going to be censored, guys. All right, we can't have the MOD telling us what we can write and we can't write. And then there was kind of very interesting debates on there about, okay, these HIMARS that have shown up, what are we going to do about them? Why is it our command haven't managed to do sensible things like disperse our command and control and things like that and so on. And you get this kind of internal debate or discussion. How reliable it is, I wouldn't want to take anything these guys say without a pinch of salt in being able to cross-reference it with other sources. But from time to time, especially on the Kherson offensive, we've seen things that some of these accounts have put out, and then you cross-reference it, and it becomes you get a bit of consensus. So I think we can say Vysokopilia has been taken by the Ukrainians because we've got some of these guys kind of acknowledging that.
And if you spoke to Russians normally, would they have heard of these guys, or are they quite sort of, you have to be active on Twitter or on Telegram, you have to be quite into your internet culture? I'm just trying to get a sense of how well known are they, how embedded are they into the culture, or is it not? Is it very much you need your internet connection, you need to sort of know the places to look?
I think my impression is and as usual, I have to caveat, I'm not in Russia at the moment, so ask a Russian. My impression is this is quite a telegrammy kind of thing, right? It's kind of beyond Telegram, scrolling through. You want to be into someone who's really into kind of following the war, and you'll find yourself subscribing to all these things. And it, is that kind of community. It's kind of online thing you could get lost in. Some people will know, some of the big name Russian war correspondents, Alexander Kots, people like that, and of course Strelkov Gherkin. He is his own thing, right? Lots of people know about him because of his role in 2014. But on the whole, I'd say this is for the war nerds, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess this is absolutely fascinating. So, asking a few questions about it from your point of view, following these guys and reading this over the past 6 months, how have they changed their positions during the invasion? Have they got more or less positive, more or less critical? What's your sense of their view of the invasion?
So again, it's not uniform. I would say they are uniformly patriotic from a Russian point of view. You are not going to find anyone who's kind of questioning the need for the war and things like that. Like quite an interesting kind of capacity for like self-reflection, right? And I think what gets up their nose is when they see the Russian Ministry of Defense putting out something they know isn't true, right? Because a lot of these guys, I think, either have links with soldiers or mercenaries, or are down there spending a lot of time on the front, and it gets up their nose when the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming something that just doesn't fit with what they're seeing and what the guys they know are going through. So there was one recently, I can't remember who it was who posted this, but when the Kherson counteroffensive began, the Russian Ministry of Defense last week immediately said, okay, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has completely failed, and we've killed 12,000 Ukrainians, and we've wiped out God knows how many tanks. So on. If you believed it, that it would have been an absolute disaster. And there was one guy got out there quite quickly. Said, let's leave that to people who want to believe in fairy tales. Basically, this is what I know happened. And he described, didn't go into details. He didn't reveal the exact position he was talking about, but he was talking about a very desperate defense by a group of Russian special forces who eventually were forced to fall back. And he said, you don't let anybody blame those guys unless you've been in that situation. What else are you meant to do? Just like sacrifice your life and be someone else's hero. Don't be dumb, So saying that he said these guys had to fall back. He kind of obliquely he strongly implied that some guys chose to stay there and die fighting and praised them and so on. But it was a very clear rebuttal to the kind of the cruder propaganda being put out officially by the Ministry of Defense.
Well, thank you very much for that, Roland. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Can I bring in Gareth Caulfield now? Gareth, you've written a long read, which is on the Telegraph's website. I'd recommend everybody go and read it. It's called How the West is Racing to Stop Ukraine's Guns Falling Silent. You took a deep look at armament resupply, ammunition resupply, weapons supply to Ukraine from the West. Would you give us a sense of your big takeaways from your work on this?
Sure, absolutely, David. So the problem, I suppose, that Ukraine is running into is that in terms of arms supply, they've been very much dependent on, once they burned out their own stockpiles fairly early on, they're pretty dependent on the West, by which I mean the NATO, mainly the NATO nations, for replenishing their stockpiles of arms, of tanks, of rocket launchers, missiles, all that kind of good stuff. And a lot of that equipment, if not most of that equipment, has come from what we call Western ready-use stockpiles, which is in simple terms, is what NATO keeps at hand in case Russia comes rolling over the eastern borders and into a NATO member state. And it's all well and good that Ukraine has been supplied from those stockpiles, but obviously, as we're now 6-7 months into the actual war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we're now starting to look at a situation where those Western ready-use stockpiles have started to run down, and that has implications both for Ukraine, their ability to keep on fighting, to keep a steady supply going, and also for the readiness of NATO itself. What if and it's an unlikely scenario to be sure, but you always have to think, what if? What if the Russians decide that they're going to go hell for leather and start charging over towards one of the eastern flank nations, such as Poland or something like that? So what I was looking at this week, along with my colleague Howard Mustoe, who is Telegraph's industry editor, is a state of those Western stockpiles and where what the situation is when it comes to actually resupplying not only Ukraine, but the West's own. Now, it gets interesting because we know from, I think, the Wall Street Journal report late last week, which said that US reserves of 155mm artillery shells are running low. Now, 155mm is one of the more commonly used natures of ammunition, of artillery ammunition, that is, in the Western artillery systems, guns and armored vehicles and so on, supplied to Ukraine. And the Wall Street Journal report reckons that the Americans have so far supplied something like 806,000 rounds of 155, which is, quite a significant number. And they were quoting sort of US defense officials there saying that this is a quite a high rate of expenditure. We've gone through almost all of our ready-use stockpiles is the implication they were seeking to convey there, and that we're now starting to looking at the sort of defence industrial base to say, well, what can you do to replenish us? So not only are our own stockpiles full, but we can also continue supplying Ukraine with all of the munitions, particularly artillery that they require. So that's one of the sort of headline takeaways there, is that we're looking at stockpiles needing to be replenished, and we start also looking in the long read at what is being done about it. What are we doing in the West to spin up production? So my colleague Howard Mustoe spoke to BAE Systems. I know he's got a read on the way, I think for this weekend possibly, about where BAE Systems is at when it comes to spinning up artillery ammunition production. Howard found that the Ukrainian officials are actually nosing around UK ammunition production plants now, specifically looking for foundries which are capable of making 155mm artillery shell casings. The casings themselves are actually quite a high skill item to produce, which is why they come into the UK amongst other sources to see if they can diversify their supply and keep that sort of constant flow of ammunition going to the Ukrainians. But yes, they're looking at, so Howard found, BAE Systems, I think it's Washington is the factory up in Tyne Wear. Sorry, I just had a little bit of a mental moment there. Yes, so just sort of coming down again. We think the Ukrainians, according to the Royal United Services Institute, we think the Ukrainians are firing somewhere around 6,000 artillery shells per day, which is quite the rate of consumption. And again, it's something that we need to be considering in the West in terms of ramping up the supply. And it's not only 155mm, it's also the M31 rockets fired by the HIMARS weapon system, which is essentially a rocket launcher bolted to a lorry. Shoot and scoot is the concept of operations there. It's a very highly valued piece of equipment, and the Ukrainians have been quite vocal about asking for more HIMARS, but also with more HIMARS comes a requirement for more ammunition. So yes, it's quite the in-depth read, David. And I suppose I could blather on for quite a while, but I'll pause there for a second.
No, that was great. Thank you, Gareth. That was incredibly comprehensive. In your article, you write about the kitchen sink approach. I'm trying to put that in quotation marks. And this was this is how the UK's response was described. What is the kitchen sink approach to supplying Ukraine, and what are the problems it's running into now?
So what I called the kitchen sink approach is where a lot of the NATO militaries of Western countries, I think there's 43 in total, not all NATO, but the vast majority are. When the initial invasion occurred, obviously the Ukrainians came to the West and said, what can you give us? Help, please. We've got the actual Russians invading us here. And the response from the West was comprehensive in all senses of the word. So as well as giving the Ukrainians large quantities of what they needed in terms, everything from helmets, body armor, missile launchers. We had lots of talk about Javelin and NLAW. I think the piece actually opens with a mention of Saint Javelin, the old image that was going around right at the start, the meme. Small stuff like that, small arms ammunition, right the way up to artillery vehicles, armored vehicles themselves, what I describe as battlefield taxis. This, what happened there was that an awful lot of obsolescent equipment, by which I mean military equipment, which is still perfectly good enough for what it's meant to do, but it's not the latest, it's not the cutting edge kind of stuff. A lot of that was dug up out of storage, dusted off, and sent to the Ukrainians. And while that's all well and good, and it gives, they say we need equipment, the West says here is equipment. That's a good thing. That gives them the ability to fight. But when you start thinking in the medium and long terms, you run into the problem of sustainment. How do you keep this equipment running? What are the spares requirements for the fleet of Husky armored vehicles, for example, that the Ministry of Defence found out of storage and sent to the Ukrainians? When you've got several different 155mm artillery systems, as the military calls them, yes, it's a 155mm barrel, but you've got it strapped to one particular type of chassis, one particular type of armored vehicle, and you've got several of those different types of armored vehicle in service. You have a logistics training and a training pipeline there as well. It's all well and good having the spare parts, but you need people trained to maintain them. They literally need to know what they're doing with the bits they've got. So that's what I mean by the kitchen sink approach, is that we've given them absolutely everything we can get our hands on in the first instance. But then that raises the problem of keeping it all running and keeping it going. Now, there's been some analyst thinking on this. I think it was the Royal United Services Institute's Dr. Jack Watling, who pointed out that having lots of very similar but ultimately slightly different bits of equipment gives them, the Ukrainians that is, gives them a bit of a headache. I think this is, here we go. One challenge here, says Dr. Watling, is that NATO standardization is not very standardized, with different countries' howitzers not only having completely different maintenance requirements, but also using different charges, fuses, and sometimes shells. And what that means in plain English is that everything's subtly different. So if you've got one particular weapon system, one particular artillery piece, let's say, which has a very specific set of requirements, you need to feed it exactly the right type of shell or the right type of targeting data or whatever it is, then you run into a problem where you may have something very similar in stock. Now, strange enough, it's on a diversion. This is something the Soviet Union actually thought about quite in depth back in the Cold War. It's something the Russians did when it came to artillery and munition standardization, was to specify everything as having a very different name for itself. So whereas in NATO militaries, you might have, we've been talking about at great depth about 155mm artillery shells. You may have 155mm, just picking up some hypothetical examples to illustrate the point here. You may have 155mm long range, you may have 155mm high explosive, you may have 155mm that does something else in terms of an effect. And what the Russians did was they said, well, we've got all these different bits and bobs. We have conscript military forces not particularly well educated and doesn't really, grasp the differences between these things. We'll just give them completely different names. So that was one way that the Soviets sort of got around this logistical problem, is saying that, right, instead of 155mm, it's 152mm. It's giving things a very, very sort of visually sort of written different names. But returning to the point about the kitchen sink and the Western supply situation in Ukraine, I keep saying it now, but the problem is essentially one of sustainment. It's keeping that equipment going. It's ramping up the industrial production. It's making sure that what the Ukrainians have can be kept running. Now, it may be the case that the Ukrainians want to make some hard choices here and say, well, it's all very well and good us having these particular things, but actually, thanks very much, we don't need any more of those. Can you specialise on, for example, M109, self-propelled artillery pieces, which are, it is literally just an artillery gun strapped to a tracked chassis, which then drives around and fires and does all its good artillery type things. So that's the kitchen sink approach. It's been helpful initially. I'm sure the Ukrainians are very happy and very grateful to have all the equipment. But as time goes on, as the war goes on, it's now a case of, can we start giving them lots of the same types of equipment and the same types of compatible ammunition to go with it to keep the Ukrainians fighting?
Just one question from me, Gareth. You touched on how the Soviets dealt with some of these issues. But can we talk about the modern Russian military? We've spoken a lot just now about how the Ukrainians are dealing with the supply issue. Do you have a sense of how the invasion has impacted and how sanctions have impacted Russian resupply for their armaments, weapons, guns, etc.?
Yes. So looking at it from the tech point of view, a lot of obviously advanced military equipment has very high-tech equipment embedded within. There's computer chips, computer boards, complete integrated subsystems and systems and so on. And a lot of Western sanctions at the sort of beginning and the outset of the war, and as time has gone on, were focused on choking off that supply chain. And to an extent, we in the West believe that have been successful. Now, we had a report a few weeks ago from the Royal United Services Institute pointing out lots of Western-made computer chips turning up in Russian cruise missiles and drones and so on. But there was a recent report, now unfortunately I don't have the reference in front of me, but a very recent report issued this weekend, and I shall tweet the link to it after this when I find it. And that report said that increasing amounts of Russian guidance systems, in particular navigation equipment, were coming out, were being discovered on the battlefield, being dismantled, and they were finding very similar commercial off-the-shelf GPS equipment embedded within them. So, sensors, GPS chips, all that sort of good stuff. And the finding of the report was that although the sanctions have constrained Russia's ability to get precisely what it wants from the global tech supply markets, these supplies of sensors and computer chips and advanced high-tech electronics, what they seem to be doing now is adapting to the impact of the sanctions and using commercial technology, stuff that anyone can buy and which is intended not to have any actual military application or any direct military use. Now, that's a problem because there's only so far you can crack down on sanctions until there becomes the suspicion, at least, that what you're doing is harming the Russian civilian population, which is not quite what sanctions are intended to do. It's all about striking that very careful balance between what can you indict, what can you put a sanction on, what can you choke off a supply of to Russia and stop their military from getting hold of it and using it, and then sort of are we actually cracking down on dual use or sole civilian use equipment, because some of that might be turning up in Russian military hardware, and that's something that yes, we do want to stop, but also that same hardware could be being used by civilians for entirely innocent purposes, for example, navigation while hill walking or something like that. So it's all very tricky. It's all very difficult to sort of crack down on those Russian supply chains and to ensure that their ability to actually keep building arms to fight the war is degraded. Tough situation, very tough situation. But the Russians are improvising, adapting and overcoming, and that's possibly not what the West or Ukraine was hoping for at this stage.
Thanks, Gareth. Just one more question from me, really. I don't know if Roland has any for you as well. But mine would be, you've sketched out the issues that after 6 months of war, the Western stockpiles are much reduced, that Western countries and defence companies are going to have to up their production in order to keep up with how fast the Ukrainians are getting through shells and weapons. But what is that situation? Should the Ukrainians be worried, or how do the next few months look like for the supply issues?
What we're seeing, certainly what's in the long read, which I recommend to everybody listening, what we're seeing is that the West is ramping up production and that these difficult conversations are being had now ahead of winter. So I keep mentioning BAE Systems. BAE certainly has been ramping up production. We're seeing the conversations being had within the US government as well about reopening old supply chains that are closed down. I think it's the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, actually. They've reopened an old production line for that, purely to service the demand from Western governments on behalf of Ukraine. And, having mentioned that, that's an important point. There is a distinction as well between direct supplies to Ukraine and supplies from governments. Now, my understanding of this is counterintuitively that it is easier for the Ukrainians to obtain supplies directly from Western governments than it is to go to the manufacturers. The idea being that the government deal is governments can squeak their own paperwork out of the way and say, yep, carry on. Here's the contents of our ready-use stockpile and we'll order more on your behalf. But if the Ukrainians go direct to the manufacturers, then you start running into essentially bureaucracy and export licensing processes and so on, which is all well and good in peacetime, but maybe not so helpful at a time like now. But returning to the topic of the supply situation going forward, it's difficult. Obviously, we're ramping up production. We're looking at reopening production lines. We're looking at scraping the international markets as best as we can for what's out there to keep the Ukrainians supplied and able to fight. But as we get into winter, as the war drags on, it is a situation of, can we keep them sustained, and can we keep our own stockpiles full enough in case something unexpected occurs in the near future?
Well, thank you very much, Gareth. Roland, just wondered if you had any questions for Gareth after that.
I think he's actually covered it very comprehensively. It's something that's been kind of nagging at my the edges of my consciousness since this war began, and we ran a few stories about it. I was speaking to Andrei Zagorodnik, the former Ukrainian defense minister a few weeks ago, earlier this summer, about exactly this issue, right? Of the West handing over, here's half a dozen French howitzers, here's half a dozen Australian armoured vehicles, here's half a dozen this. And he said, well, there's a term for this, for a place where you've got one of everything. It's called a zoo. And he said, it's a real headache. There's spare parts, there's training, maintenance, all of this stuff. So this issue about rationalising supply. Also, it feeds into the 152 to 155 thing, right? So 152 mil was the standard Soviet artillery round. And early in the war, as we understand, the Ukrainians and the Russians both had people, and Western governments had people scour, every arms dealer in Africa, in and out of the Balkans, Southeast Asia, anywhere you could go, people were trying to outbid each other to get this stuff. And that, as we understand, that's either run out or it's going to run out. The Russians probably have a lot more to supply their stuff, but that's one reason why this switch to 155 mil, this NATO supplied stuff is so critical. And it's kind of reassuring to hear that, as Gareth says, difficult conversations are happening. They are expanding production. They are talking about, opening up supply lines. But I mean, when I was asking people about this, one of the answers I got was, well, you can't just take the garden, you can't take the railings off the park fence and 3 months later you've got a Spitfire. It doesn't work like that. I didn't know, actually. I'm interested if you know anything more, Gareth, about what you were saying about the casings of a 155 millimeter shell being quite a high precision thing. I kind of imagined that was something you could churn out quite easily. But the things like NLAWs, Javelin anti-tank missiles, especially these GMLRs, they call them, that the HIMARS fire. I mean, these are not easy things to turn out. It's precision engineering. So it's a challenge to increase the production of that. And the only other thing I would add on the HIMARS thing, so the GMLRs, I was told, there's just not that many of them in the world. And America has most of them, but it is the weapon they need to, as the insurance in their back pocket, should anything happen anywhere else in the world. We've all got our eyes, half an eye on Taiwan, things like that. And that's one reason why you've got, going back to my conversation with Andrei Sokorodnik back in summer, or any other Ukrainian official you care to mention, or any Ukrainian frontline soldier for that matter, or Ukrainian civilian, the message is always the same. Look, come on, why are you just giving us just enough to kind of draw but not enough to win? Like, well, what's going on? And I think the basic answer is this logistical question. So I mean, I will definitely, I haven't read it, but I am going to be reading Gareth's long read with great interest, because I think it's a really, really important, one of the most important issues in this war.
Thanks, Roland. Gareth, anything from you on that, or shall I ask for your final thoughts?
I'm happy to expand a little bit on GMLRs.
Please.
Guided Multiple Launch Rocket System, GMLRS. The Ukrainians have a handful of those, as Roland says. They're US in origin. They're very keen on getting their hands on GMLRs and on HIMARS, two of the most effective, as my military sources have described this to me, grid square removal tools. So this is an artillery system which you can point at a particular area of ground and it will destroy everything within that area. Supply of those is critical. These are frontline weapon systems for many NATO armies. These are sort of state-of-the-art technology. And while the Ukrainians are obviously very keen to get their hands on them, it's a case of, as I was speaking about earlier, balancing the supply. Can we give them enough to fight an effective war without compromising our own military capabilities too much, just in case something else happens that needs a military response from the West? Ammunition supply for those is also, I've spoken at great length about 155 mil, but also the M31 rocket launched by GMLRs and HIMARS. That's also one of the potential bottlenecks in production that the West has been looking at. It's one of those situations where lots of conversations are, so we're told, being had in the background, where contracts are being signed, where stockpiles are being replenished and immediately shipped out east. But we'll see in the coming months how that's going to turn out.
Well, thank you very much, Gareth, for joining us today, and thank you, Roland. Can I just ask for your final thoughts for our listeners? What should they be thinking of in the days to come?
I would say, let's look at let's look at Liz Truss's government, shall we? I don't see a massive change in direction. I think, as Tony was saying earlier, continuity candidate, but oh my God, is she up against it? It is the perfect storm. War in Europe, related energy crisis, related inflation crisis. I think it's going to be massively, massively challenging. And the reason I'm talking about domestic British politics is because, once again, as I always drone on about, this winter is going to be the test, not just for us, but for the American public, for European publics, and for all those governments that have chosen to back Ukraine in this war. And the Russians, the Kremlin, is absolutely banking on the idea that we're not going to get through this winter without our resolve cracking in one way or another. So that's the thing on my mind this week.
Thanks, Roland. Gareth Caulfield, would you like the final words?
Yeah, I think I'd echo everything Roland says there. Liz Truss, as the new Prime Minister, has an awful lot to contend with, any of which in isolation would have been quite the big thing. But looking at the Ukraine situation, certainly she'll be continuing those conversations about supplies, about keeping those stockpiles full, about signing contracts. And we know that she has mentioned a potential rise in UK defence spending. Whether that's going to feed into the whether that's essentially money earmarked for Ukraine via that government-to-government sales route I mentioned earlier, too early to tell just yet. But if that's coming out of the main MOD budget rather than what they used to call urgent operational requirements, which is essentially money gifted them straight from the Treasury. Too early to tell, I would say, but it's a difficult situation as winter starts setting in and as the Ukrainians start crystallising what they need more of and what they perhaps need less of. I think that's going to be the interesting point, because we're going to start, I suspect, seeing more and more increasingly modern weapon systems being supplied as those global stocks of the older Soviet era stuff, which has already passed out of use, as Roland's mentioned, but also the sort of the diverse range of Western systems trimmed down so we can realistically keep supplying ourselves from our direct stockpiles. So I suspect we're going to see more of the modern weapon systems coming up ahead.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.